Spring of 1944. A German soldier, barely 19 years old, stands on the deck of an American transport ship crossing the Atlantic. His name is Werner Kritzinger, and just 3 weeks ago, he was fighting American troops in the frozen hills of Italy. Now he's a prisoner of war, heading to the country he was taught to see as his enemy. He expects concentration camps, starvation, maybe execution. After all, that's what Goebbels' propaganda told them would happen if they were captured by the barbaric Americans. But when Werner steps off that ship in Norfolk, Virginia, what he sees makes absolutely no sense. The American guards aren't brutal. They're bored, almost casual. They hand him a sandwich, white bread, real meat, actual butter. Werner hasn't seen butter in 2 years. He thinks it's a trick. Maybe they fatten prisoners before the torture begins. Then they load him onto a train. Not a cattle car, an actual passenger train with cushioned seats. The train rolls through the American countryside, and Werner presses his face against the window, staring at something that seems impossible. Farms with full barns, streets with cars, children playing with toys, stores with windows full of food. "Where are the bombed buildings?" he whispers to another prisoner. "Where is the destruction?" There is none. America hasn't been touched by war. Over the next 2 years, Werner and 400,000 other German POWs will be scattered across America, from Texas to Wisconsin, from Georgia to Montana. They'll work on farms, build roads, harvest crops, and slowly, something will happen that neither the Germans nor the Americans expected. These young men, raised under Hitler's regime, told that democracy was weak and decadent, will discover something that will shake them to their core. Everything they were taught was a lie. This is the story of how German prisoners of war came to America expecting hell and found something that changed them forever: the unexpected welcome. The first thing that shocked German POWs wasn't cruelty, it was abundance. Franz Altheimer, a Luftwaffe mechanic captured in North Africa, later wrote in his memoir, "We expected revenge. We expected to be treated the way we treated Russian prisoners. Instead, they gave us chocolate." The Geneva Convention required that POWs be treated humanely, but America went far beyond the minimum requirements. And this wasn't just policy, it was practical strategy. General George Marshall had personally insisted that German prisoners be treated well, not out of kindness, but calculation. He knew that well-treated German POWs would spread the word, and in the final years of the war, when German soldiers faced the choice between surrendering to the Russians in the East or the Americans in the West, that reputation would matter. But the POWs arriving in 1943 and 1944 didn't know about Marshall's strategy. They just knew they were being fed 3 meals a day, real meals with meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee. Many of them were gaining weight for the first time since the war started. At Camp Conquerdora in Kansas, a German POW named Helmut Herner would later recall, "I thought there must be a mistake. I thought this level of food was only for the officers. Then I realized, no, this is what ordinary American soldiers eat, every day." By 1945, the United States had constructed over 500 POW camps across the country, with a total population of about 425,000 German prisoners. The camps ranged from massive facilities holding thousands to small work camps with just a few dozen men. The largest was Camp Alva in Oklahoma, which held over 5,000 prisoners. But most German POWs ended up in smaller camps attached to agricultural regions. The reason was simple: America had a massive labor shortage. Millions of American men were overseas fighting the war. American farms, the breadbasket that fed both America and its allies, were desperately short of workers. Crops were rotting in fields. The government made a calculated decision: use enemy prisoners to harvest American food. It was a strange arrangement. German soldiers who had been shooting at Americans just months ago were now being trucked out to American farms to pick cotton in Texas, harvest wheat in Kansas, cut timber in Oregon. The work was supervised but not harsh. POWs were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, money that could be spent at the camp canteen on cigarettes, candy, toiletries, even beer. This was more than symbolic. It was a taste of something most Germans had never experienced: consumer choice. The culture shock. For young men raised in Nazi Germany, where every aspect of life had been militarized and controlled, America was bewildering. George Gertner, who escaped from a Colorado POW camp in 1945 and lived secretly in America for 40 years before surrendering, described his first impression. Everything was so casual. Americans didn't march, they strolled. They didn't salute every officer, they waved. Guards would sit and eat lunch with us, talking about baseball, which we didn't understand at all. The informality of American culture was deeply confusing to men conditioned by rigid military hierarchy. At Camp Hearn in Texas, a German officer complained to the American commandant that enlisted men and officers were being housed too close together, that it violated proper military protocol. The American commandant shrugged and said, "Well, you're all prisoners now. Ranks don't mean much here." This was radical. In the German military, the distinction between officers and enlisted men was absolute. Now, in these American camps, that hierarchy was melting away. But the real shock came from interaction with American civilians. Meeting the enemy. Unlike in German or Japanese POW camps, where prisoners were kept isolated from civilian populations, American POW camps were often located right next to small towns. And Americans, to the astonishment of the Germans, were curious rather than hateful. At Camp Algona in Iowa, local families would sometimes come to the camp fence to talk with prisoners. Farmers who employed POW labor often invited them to eat lunch at their homes. German POWs would sit at American kitchen tables, eating sandwiches made by American housewives, playing with American children. Werner Fischer, captured at Normandy and sent to a camp in Wisconsin, recalled, "A farmer's wife asked me about my family. When I told her my mother was in Hamburg, which had been bombed, she cried. This American woman cried for my German mother. I could not understand it." This basic human kindness, extended by people whose sons were dying fighting Germany, created profound cognitive dissonance. The Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as either weak and decadent or barbaric and cruel. But the reality was neither. They weren't weak. Their farms produced incredible abundance. Their factories churned out weapons in quantities Germany couldn't match. But they weren't barbaric either. They were just people. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, largely untouched by the total war consuming Europe. One of the most unexpected aspects of the POW experience was how work transformed the prisoner's perspective. In Nazi ideology, labor was glorified but also hierarchical. There were jobs for superior men and jobs for inferior men. Manual agricultural labor was considered beneath educated Germans. That's what Slavic subhumans were for. But in America, POWs discovered that farmers were respected members of their communities. The German prisoners working on ranches in Texas met ranch owners who were prosperous, educated men who chose to work with their hands. This was incomprehensible in the Nazi framework. At Camp Trinidad in Colorado, a group of German POWs were sent to work on a sugar beet farm owned by a man named John Schneider, himself a German-American, his grandparents having emigrated in the 1880s. Schneider spoke fluent German, having learned it from his grandparents. Over lunch one day, a young POW named Klaus Hartmann asked him, "How can you be German and American at the same time?" Schneider laughed. "I'm not German," he said. "My grandparents were German. I'm American. That's how this country works. You can come from anywhere, but if you believe in the American idea, you're American." This concept, that national identity could be chosen rather than inherited by blood, was revolutionary to men raised in a regime obsessed with racial purity. The power of plenty. Nothing undermined Nazi ideology more effectively than American abundance. German POWs at Camp Rupert in Idaho were taken to a local grocery store to buy items for the camp canteen. They walked through aisles stocked with products: canned goods, fresh vegetables, meat, dairy products, sweets, bread. One prisoner, Rudolf Pfeiffer, later wrote, "I stood there with my mouth open like a fool. There was more food in that one small-town store than in all of Berlin." The propaganda had told them that America was on the brink of collapse, that British and American civilians were starving while their governments fought an unjust war. But here was a town in the middle of Idaho, with more food than Germany had seen since before the war. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, POWs were allowed to watch American movies. The first film they saw was a musical comedy, something light and disposable, typical Hollywood entertainment. But what shocked the Germans wasn't the plot. It was the background. In scene after scene, they saw ordinary American homes. Houses with multiple rooms, furniture, appliances. Cars in driveways. Streets with shops. Even in a silly movie not trying to show off American prosperity, the baseline standard of living was staggering. "Even their poor people have more than our officers," one prisoner muttered. Education and re-education. The American military, particularly under the guidance of psychological warfare experts, began a subtle re-education program. This wasn't crude propaganda. The Americans had learned from British intelligence that heavy-handed attempts to brainwash POWs would backfire, causing them to double down on Nazi beliefs. Instead, the approach was indirect: exposure. POWs were given access to books, newspapers, magazines. Not censored Nazi publications, but actual information. Many camps had libraries stocked with German-language books, including works that had been banned in Germany. Books by Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, banned philosophy and history. At Camp Dermot in Arkansas, a university professor named Howard Mumford Jones began offering voluntary classes in American history and government. He expected maybe a dozen curious prisoners. Over 200 showed up. Jones taught them about the American Revolution, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. He explained the concept of individual liberty, limited government, democratic elections. For young men who had known only totalitarianism, these ideas were fascinating and strange. The newspaper that changed everything. Perhaps the most significant tool in the re-education effort was a newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call. Published by the U.S. War Department but edited by German POWs, Der Ruf walked a careful line. It wasn't American propaganda. That would have been dismissed immediately. Instead, it was German intellectuals and writers, themselves prisoners, grappling with what Germany had become and what it might become after the war. The newspaper published essays by POWs debating Germany's future. It featured letters from prisoners describing their experiences in America. It reprinted articles from international press showing the true scope of Nazi atrocities. The concentration camps, the mass murders, the industrial genocide that most ordinary German soldiers had no idea about. When the first photographs from liberated concentration camps circulated through the POW camps in spring 1945, the reaction was complex. Many prisoners refused to believe it. British propaganda, they said. Lies to justify the war. But some couldn't dismiss it so easily. These men had seen how honest Americans had been about everything else. The food was real, the prosperity was real, the freedom was real. Why would they suddenly lie about this? At Camp Concordia, a group of prisoners gathered around a copy of Life magazine showing photographs from Buchenwald. One prisoner, Hans Werner, stared at the images for a long time. Finally, he said quietly, "What have we done? What have we been part of?" This wasn't universal. Many POWs remained committed Nazis until the end and even after. But for others, the cognitive dissonance between what they'd been taught and what they'd experienced became unbearable. Breaking bread with the enemy. Despite strict regulations prohibiting fraternization, genuine friendships formed between American civilians and German POWs. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, a farmer named Albert Faulkner employed several German prisoners to help with his wheat harvest. One of them, a young man named Matthias Koch, was from a farming family in Bavaria. Over the course of the summer, Faulkner and Koch bonded over their shared knowledge of agriculture. Faulkner invited Koch to his home for Sunday dinner, technically a violation of regulations, but enforcement in rural Kansas was lax. Koch met Faulkner's family, including his son, who was serving in the army in France. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A German soldier eating dinner with a family whose son was fighting Germans in Europe. Koch asked Mrs. Faulkner if she hated him. She thought for a long moment, then said, "No, I hate this war. I hate what it's done to all our young men. But you're just a boy who got caught up in something bigger than yourself." This sentiment was surprisingly common. Americans could separate the Nazi regime from the individual German soldiers. This ability to hate the ideology while showing compassion to the person was something new to many POWs. Music and art. One unexpected area of connection was culture. Many POW camps formed orchestras, theater groups, and art classes. German cultural sophistication, the country of Bach, Beethoven, and Goethe, was something Americans respected. Local communities were sometimes invited to POW camp concerts. At Camp Papago Park in Arizona, a POW orchestra performed Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The camp commandant invited local residents. Over 300 Americans came to watch German prisoners perform one of the masterpieces of Western civilization. The newspaper headline the next day read, "Enemy prisoners remind us what we're fighting for: civilization itself." This was a subtle but powerful message. Germany had been a nation of culture and learning. Nazism had corrupted that. By reclaiming their cultural heritage, Germans could reclaim their humanity. The veterans who understood. Some of the most meaningful connections came from American veterans of World War I who remembered fighting Germans as honorable enemies. In Texas, an elderly American named Patrick Murphy, who had fought in the Meuse-Argonov offensive in 1918, regularly visited the local POW camp. He would talk with prisoners about his experiences fighting the Kaiser's army. He told them, "We fought like hell, and then when it was over, we went home. No hard feelings. You're not monsters, you're soldiers who fought for your country. That's respectable, even if your leaders weren't." This acknowledgement of their humanity, not as Nazis, but as soldiers who had done their duty, was powerful. Many POWs felt dehumanized by their own regime, which treated soldiers as expendable. Being treated as individuals with dignity was a novel experience.